like to acknowledge and pay respects to the ancestors, descendants, and elders, past, present, and emerging, of the people of the Bunjalung nation upon whose land we're holding this event tonight. So tonight's talk is entitled Life in a Socialist Future. And until fairly recently, socialism was regarded in some circles as a dirty word. It was edited out of most mainstream political discussion. Just to utter the word or to claim to be a socialist was almost heretical in an era of conservative politics. This is Richard's written this. It's good. But the times, they are a-changing. Thanks in part to the rise of Bernie Sanders in the US and Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, socialism has crept back into the public lexicon. Not that it ever really disappeared as an idea about how we might organize our society around the common good rather than the privileged interest. Distinguished Professor of Economics at the University of Queensland, John Quiggin, takes us tonight on a journey of exploration into an idea whose time has come again. What does it mean to live in a socialist society? Why is this preferable to what we are currently experiencing? How can we avoid the errors of the past to make socialism a credible and fulfilling way of life? These are some of the questions that I hope will be addressed by Professor Quiggin tonight. So, John Quiggin is a Vice Chancellor's Senior Fellow in Economics at the University of Queensland. He's prominent both as a research economist and as a commentator on Australian and international economic policy. He's a fellow of the Econometric Society, the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, and many other learned societies and institutions. He has produced over 1,500 publications, and he's still so young. This includes 6 books and over 200 articles in fields including decision theory, environmental economics, production economics, and the theory of economic growth. He's also written on policy topics including climate change, microeconomic reform, privatization, employment policy, and the management of the Murray-Darling River system. Many of those topics dear to a lot of our hearts, I know. John has been an active contributor to Australian public debate in a wide range of media. He frequently comments on policy issues for radio and TV. He was one of the first Australian academics to present publications on a website. So that must have been a long time ago. And one of the first to start a blog as far back as 2002, which provided daily comments on a wide range of topics. So he's definitely an initiator, as we can see. His book, which tonight is part of the raffle prize, and if you want to just go to one of the tables and get a few more raffle tickets, it looks like a super exciting book. The Zombie Economics, How Dead Ideas Still Walk Among Us. Good title, great reviews I noticed on the back from the Financial Times and other places. Looks like a good, easy read. And it's been translated into 8 languages, so it must be good. And his latest book is called Economics in 2 Lessons, and it is only just available for pre-order. It's just gone to the States to be published. And he set up a Facebook page where you can read extracts, and the Facebook page is just John Quiggin. I think it's that you find it. So let's have a really warm round of applause, Mullumbimby warm round of applause for Professor John Quiggin.
Thanks very much, Pamela, and thanks, Richard, and everybody for inviting me. I'd also like to acknowledge traditional owners and elders past, present, and emerging. So I spend most of my time dealing with issues like what to do about the mess in electricity and things like that. But and in that context, I think we can see the failure of the set of ideas that have been called economic rationalism or neoliberalism. We can see governments that were previously all on about the free market suddenly saying they should subsidise coal-fired power stations and jump on the evil energy monopolies and so forth. So in that sense, given the failures of the ideas that have dominated the last 30 or 40 years, it's unsurprising people are looking for new ideas. Unfortunately, as we know, not all of those ideas are appealing or an improvement on the present. A large part of the attraction is very dark ideas of racism, of dominant identity politics, the kind represented, for example, by Donald Trump. In that context, to simply say, well, look, we can manage things better and you don't need to do this stuff, I don't think is an adequate solution. And that's why we've seen an appeal to the kind of radical heritage implied by a word like socialism. But for the moment, that word doesn't mean very much. I don't think many people are keen on the idea of central planning as in the Soviet Union in the 1950s and 1960s. Roughly speaking, I think what it means is something like social democracy with a spine. That is the kind of thing the Labor Party in Australia and similar parties overseas used to stand for back in the 40s and 50s and 60s and abandoned in the pursuit of accommodation with neoliberalism. So a large part of what we mean, I think, by socialism is a return to the hopes that the older members of the audience, including me, would have had growing up in the 1960s. It seemed that we were in many ways on a path to a better society where we would steadily eliminate racism and sexism. We'd examine our attitudes to things like gay people, which were then very unquestioned when I was growing up, that these things would change, and at the same time that the economy will continue to deliver better living standards and more equality, while at the same time we started to address issues like the environment and so forth. That seemed to be a very reasonable hope when I was growing up, say when the Whitlam government was elected in 1972. So we know things haven't turned out like that, and someone like me has spent most of my working career in essentially a defensive struggle against neoliberalism, trying to preserve Medicare, preserve as much as we could of public ownership, try and maintain a progressive tax system and so forth. I think though the time for that defence has passed, we now need to look to the future, and we need therefore a positive vision. As I've implied, part of that is just to say, well, let's go back to what we had 30 or 40 years ago and carry it forward. But obviously that's not enough. The world has changed radically in crucial ways, particularly in relation to energy and to information and communications technology, the internet and so forth. And before I go on, just to remind everyone, the internet is a product of the public sector stolen by the corporations. It was the universities and the public sector that created the internet. Google was developed in a university. They then took that and turned it into a multi-billion-dollar evil corporation. All the big ideas here come from the public sector, as indeed does the computer itself. So those points are important. What I want to do, as I've said, is talk about life in a socialist future. Now, given my background, I'm not such a one for the full utopian vision, so what I thought, rather than trying to create the ideal, is to say, well, with luck I've got another 30 years or so left on the planet. What could things reasonably be like in 30 years' time for somebody born now in 20, and how could they live in 2050? Now, obviously, in the nature of things, utterly incomplete transformations take a very long time, much more, I think, than 30 years. But we can imagine, I think, a much better society than we have now. And so I start by picking somebody who I'm going to call Ali. Ali was born about 2020 and is now 30. What's Ali doing? Well, like most young people, Ali completed high school. That's an achievement which we're only just reaching, and went on to university and all forms of higher education, post-school education, have been free for a long time now. Ali doesn't remember a time when those things were paid for. Not merely universities, but in particular and importantly, vocational education has been integrated so that virtually everybody gets some post-school education, or nearly everyone. And but not everyone. So we have to recognise in this world that there will be people who aren't keen to stay on at school, even if you call it university, into their 20s, and who aren't fitted for a trade, people who will want to do something else. And so I've given Ali a partner called Sam, and Sam runs a coffee shop. And I suppose this is the crucial point about my utopia. A utopia without coffee shops would be no utopia at all. And so I'm going to say that in this utopia there's still plenty of room for small business. I think the idea of the kind of doctrinaire socialism where we do the calculations based on some theory of capital, I think has no appeal. But in this world, since Sam didn't go to university, didn't go to TAFE, Sam got $100,000 from the government to start up the coffee shop. So this is a grant which everybody gets, which they pay back over their lifetime through the tax system. Those who make big money pay more, those who don't make so much perhaps don't repay the whole sum. So Sam has the coffee shop, Ali works in a credit union, and basically these days that's what's left of the financial system. Sometime in the 2020s there was another big financial crisis, and this time we learned our lesson. We closed down the vast bulk of the financial system, derivatives markets, international trade, international global financial markets, derivatives, investment banks, returned the financial system to the basic function of taking people's savings and returning them to be invested in housing and productive investment. The kind of financial system, roughly speaking, that we had back in the 1950s, which worked perfectly well in a market economy. To keep that in place globally, we introduced ideas which have been around for a long time, and one of them is a financial transactions tax. I mean, this idea helped to get the Nobel Prize for James Tobin, one of the great progressive economists of the 20th century. What it really means is the kind of high-speed computer transactions that dominate financial trade today are simply unprofitable because the government takes 0.5% each time, and essentially if you transfer $1 trillion around the world 20 times, before you know it, you've handed over billions of dollars in taxation, and so these markets have simply disappeared as a result. Sad to say, the tax doesn't raise the kind of money some of its proponents have hoped, because the primary purpose of the tax, like for example the tobacco tax, is to stop the activity of taxes, not to raise lots of money. So that's sort of one aspect. Now, most people are still working in jobs, but these days we have a standard 4-day week with 25 to 30 hours of work, and that's a resumption of a trend, of course, which was going on steadily from the achievement of the 8-hour day in the 1860s. So something where Australia led the world right up to the 1970s. We expected to see steady reductions in hours of work, steady increases in the amount of annual leave we received. All those things were expected. There were a bunch, of course, of worry wards. You said, what will we do with all that leisure? How will we occupy ourselves? It turned out of all the things you might have to worry about, what we do with our free time off work turned out not to be among the problems that needed to be addressed. Now, of course, the problem does exist now, but I'm an optimist. Most people find something to do. I do triathlons. Other people paint. Other people, I think there are so many life projects that the vast majority of us could pursue, that the idea that somehow after 30 hours of work, and after those of us who have kids have finished raising the kids, that we're going to sit around scratching for something to do, I find pretty implausible. So I think there's a great deal of room for those activities. And so, of course, nothing comes for free. My second book, Economics in 2 Lessons, is all about the concept of opportunity cost. And roughly speaking, that says when you take something, you usually have to you make a choice, you give up whatever it is you didn't choose. And obviously, if we return to a world in which the benefits of technological progress are taken to a significant extent in the form of improved leisure, that implies we won't see so much growth in wages, so much growth in material living standards. On the other hand, precisely because of technological growth, we don't need a substantial reduction in living standards compared to the middle-class lifestyle that the majority of Australians enjoy today. As part of this process, very rich people will cease to exist. There were no billionaires in Australia in the 1950s. We certainly don't need billionaires to make a society work, and that is a little bit of the part of the gains we get is that the incomes of people at the very top are substantially reduced. That, of course, makes more room for everything else. The other side of increased leisure and slower growth in material living standards, of course, is a more sustainable economy. That is, we, instead of using technological progress to make more and more things using more and more inputs, instead we make roughly the same amount of things, or perhaps a little more, using less inputs more efficiently, using less labour, but also less of the Earth's resources. And in this context, of course, it's important to note energy is the big issue. And here is one of the big changes compared to the post-war path we left. We now have the problem of climate change, but we also have the solution at hand. We already have the technology for a completely renewable electricity supply and the technology to replace most uses of fossil-fueled energy other than with renewable electricity. So that by 2050, we've long ago forgotten about the lumps of coal being brought into Parliament and that kind of stuff. We've taken a realistic approach, and the result is that we now have abundant, cheap, renewable energy, largely locally generated, but with a transmission network, with a transmission and large distribution network that's been returned to public ownership. And so that's one large area of the corporate world, newly created and disastrous, as we've seen, that's disappeared. Similarly, coming back to Sam and the coffee shop, the large-scale competition and the franchise system have disappeared. The kind of exploitation that we see from franchise systems is gone, and instead we have perhaps less efficient in some ways, but lots of small independent shops, again in the way that functioned perfectly well in a market society 50 or 100 years ago. So that's really in this future, the big corporations are confined to large-scale operations producing consumer goods largely with robots, and there's still plenty of those things. There's fridges and there's computers, and those things are still being made in this world mostly by private corporations because they still have a talent for finding things that people want and producing them and selling them. On the other hand, not very many people work for these enterprises. They're well paid, but again, returning to the relatively recent past, no one can earn more than 5 times the average wage. And that might sound radical, but in the US of the 1950s, the typical chief executive officer earned about 8 times the average wage of the employees. So there's nothing startlingly radical about many of these things. And I suppose this is the central point. I like to try and get in the utopian mode, but I'm all about feasibility, things that can actually be done if we only have the right political will, something that can inspire people, I hope, but that is eminently achievable. So, in this story, the great majority of formal employment is in the public and non-profit sectors, and there's a vibrant community sector supported through government support, and a move away from the kind of audit and monitoring culture that characterises what government support we have for the community now, where essentially, if you set up a community organisation, the government says, well, we'd like you to do our work for us at half the cost. We'll give you some money as long as you submit regular reports on how precisely you're achieving your KPIs. And similar, we have much more room for initiatives of all kinds to flourish. But as well as formal employment, there'd be lots of people who aren't in formal employment, who are receiving what Anthony Atkinson, the late British economist, has called a participation income, for doing things of value to the community, but nonetheless not in the market. And most obviously that includes raising children, but also all kinds of projects, volunteer projects and so forth, that people might wish to pursue that don't create a marketable product, but nonetheless are valuable. And so obviously I'm making my own assumptions here, but my belief is that with this kind of world, the great majority of people would be making a contribution. Nonetheless, a central feature would be that it would be a world free of compulsion to work. Below that, there would be a universal basic income available to everyone unconditionally. If you had nothing better to do with your time, or had found nothing better than to stay at home and play video games or watch daytime TV, you'll get an income roughly equivalent, say, to today's old age pension. And of course, we don't see anything wrong with people who have managed to survive to 65 or 66 or 67, whatever it is, staying home and watching daytime TV or whatever they choose. Just as we equally don't see anything wrong with them continuing to work or continuing to contribute to the community. So my view would be that we can, looking at the numbers, we can board all of that on the assumption that, roughly speaking, output per hour worked in the market sector has roughly doubled over this time. And that's, I think, a fairly conservative assumption, given the kind of technological progress we're seeing, and given the marvels of compound interest, where 2%, 2 and a bit percent over 30 years comes out to 100%. It's a marvellous thing. And I have a mathematics degree, so I'm always excited by any of those kinds of stories. So that, I think, is the core of the kind of vision I want to present. One in which not only do we return to the path that we left mistakenly in the 1970s and 1980s, we carry it further. I haven't talked much about information and communications technology, although I think that's crucial. I think the first step, which I hope in this story will happen very soon, is the abolition of intellectual property. So we'll end patents and copyrights. Books, I hope maybe somebody will copy my book and sell it, but I hope maybe that still people will buy enough legit copies that I'll get something from it. We would have instead research driven by public funding, by prizes and contests and things like that, but we would get rid of the intellectual property monopolies of which dominate the big companies of the internet today, and we'd also get rid of advertising finance at the internet, which I think I think this is a plausible belief, because if we look at the whole problem of fake news and so forth, the disasters which have befallen Facebook, Twitter and Google, they really come down to the fact that these are essentially companies selling advertising. If they're in the business, as Google originally was, of selling search services, it would certainly face difficulties because no one can agree exactly on what's right, but they wouldn't face the fundamental problem that they're not really in the business of putting people in touch with information at all. They're in the business of selling stuff. And so I think we would expect to see a universal and free access to an internet in which there are a range of services which were publicly supported and which provided people with opportunities to take advantage, of course, of improvements which we can't yet foresee, given the pace at which things change, but getting rid of problems which have emerged since the commercialisation of the internet around about 2000. So, and again, I think this is important in terms of there's still a widespread belief that we can't have decent living standards for everybody in the world, given the number of people there are. If we can get an extensible supply of renewable energy, and we can switch from a materials-based society to one in which large elements of stuff are done electronically through the internet, we can have massively improved living standards for everybody in the world. And in this context, I always think, if you take a kid in Africa with a mobile phone and even a spotty internet connection, they have something which Bill Gates didn't have 20 years ago. No one had 20 years ago. There is a possibility for these technologies used correctly to provide massive improvements for everybody without any significant environmental impact. And so I see the possibility of a sustainable world, and hopefully, I'm now getting right in utopian mode because humans are crazy creatures, hopefully a world like this will be a world where nobody felt the need to fight wars or to kill other people because they have the wrong religion or the wrong skin colour or something of that kind, one where we didn't feel the need to close borders and lock people out, because I think we can deliver greatly improved living standards for everyone. So I think I've covered my time, so I'll ask for take questions and comments now. Thank you.
It was a great talk, but we would like to know more about the democratic structures, the political structures on several levels you would imagine in this utopia.
Yeah, thanks. As an economist, I tend not to think too much about the politics of things, but I'm, I guess, a believer in subsidiarity, which comes out of Catholic social doctrine, I think. But the idea that everything should be decided at the most local level possible. But of course, that doesn't mean everything is decided locally, because there are issues, most obviously climate change. We can't decide that locally. We have to have a global decision as well as a local decision. So I suppose that's my first principle, that I'm a believer in as much localism as possible. I'm still within the realm of the feasible, so I guess I don't see fundamental changes in democratic political structures. I still see representative democracy. I still imagine, for example, Australia would have a parliament and hopefully by then a president rather than a king or queen, or governor general. But so I still see something more or less like the current system, but of course without the corrupting power of big money, because there wouldn't be the big money to corrupt it.
And would the localised democracy involve land reform?
Well, I must admit I haven't really thought about that very much. I mean, I'm an agricultural economist by trade, and so I suppose originally at least, so I suppose I still think in terms very much of the family farm as the natural unit of operation for agriculture. And I guess I tend to leave housing to one side as a topic. I just haven't really got a good answer on housing. Thanks.
What's something that's significantly shifted already in that direction, and what are the next 3 changes that are coming?
Yeah, so I think an obvious and significant change has been the collapse of faith in privatisation. I mean, just today we're seeing the Liberal government saying we're going to build coal-fired power stations. Well, I mean, that's a crazy idea, but what it says is they no longer have any faith that the market will deliver the kind of outcomes that they want. They no longer have any qualms about saying this. There's lots of things we know they can't say, although we jumped on by the right-wing commentariat, but if there's lots of things they can't say, but they can say, yes, we'll get the government to build power stations. So I think we've seen the failure of privatisation in electricity, but also in other areas. Of course, we managed to make a mess of the NBN, but again, the fact we had it at all reflects, again, the failure of privatisation there. So I think the idea that privatised infrastructure is the way of the future, I think, is something that's already passed. I think, in the US context, the acceptance of Obamacare that was something which faced a vast amount of political resistance and is now established. And so I think we are seeing a loss of faith on the other side across a whole range of economic issues. As I say, unfortunately, the reaction hasn't been to move to the centre or the left, but rather to find anybody in any outgroup to blame for the fact that things haven't gone the way they want.
And the next few changes that are coming?
So I think, as I say, I think it's time. I'm working on the universal basic income idea, but I think the first step and the point where we have a sharp campaign is participation income, to say, in place of the kind of punitive chasing after dole bludgers and addressing people. Instead of that, say, well, look, we're in a world where between the push in one direction from automation and the fact that we're richer, we can actually afford to say, let's give people an income to do something useful, rather than saying you have to apply for 20 paying jobs, and if it isn't a paying job, it doesn't count. So I think that will be an area where I'd be seeing a sharp push in the medium term. Of course, restoring progressivity to the tax system. Here we are actually seeing movement from the Labor Party in the first time in even living memory. It's even the Whitlam government didn't need, because of bracket creep, didn't need to actually propose higher tax rates as indeed Labor is doing right now. So I mean, it's flown under the radar, but that issue is back on the agenda.
I spy somebody under 20. Have you got a question?
Do you still believe that privatization or commercialization of software ideals and software ideas, proprietary software in other words, is still maintainable in a socialist society?
So as I said, I would be looking at an end to intellectual property, so that would imply a change away from some current models. Of course, things like open source software have been around; they don't rely on intellectual property. So I haven't got a fully developed vision, but it will be one in which, we're not looking at intellectual property as a way of generating innovation. We're looking at a combination of creativity for its own sake, the kind of thing that gave us Wikipedia, gave us blogs, all of those kinds of things. Plus, models like prizes, there are problems which are important but which nobody's going to work on, where the government will say we need the next TCP/IP, we'll give a prize to somebody who can come up with what's needed here. I think there's a lot of models. As I say, in this context, I don't see a need for proprietary software.
As I look back over the last century, not that I'm that old, but I look back that far, often the difficulty is with the new vision of utopia that there's a minority of people who don't like it. And they mightn't like it because it's destroying their economic situation, their privilege, or it might be religious based, and they then become militant. And the people in charge of this socialist or utopian vision then decide they need to be crushed. And then during that course of events, there's an attack on human rights. And this has occurred in the case of Stalin, Mao Zedong, and the Stasi in East Germany, just to mention a few. Is the militant minority in opposition a problem?
Sure. Well, I suppose, as I say, my inspiration isn't Marxism-Leninism. I think it had the seeds of change and structure from the start, but rather the social democracy of the 1950s and 1960s in Western Europe, but even to a large extent driving developments here. And I would say of all of the economic and political systems and ideologies you can name, social democracy is the one that's oppressed and killed least people. Capitalism has certainly got millions of deaths to its credit in famines and wars. Stalinism and Leninism do too. So does traditionalism. So I suppose my view is that is very much one that's committed to democracy, and one, as I say, that carries on from what seemed to be a move towards a more equal and democratic and fair and free society that we had proceeding for many decades from Australia, from the election or the rise of the Curtin government in the early 1940s, right through to the end of the Whitlam government in the 1970s. We seem to be moving in that way. We didn't need concentration camps or anything to deliver that. It was really the people to our right and left who did, and in some sense. So I see a democratic process rather than an authoritarian.
Is it too utopian or even desirable to think we might get rid of private education and health?
So, I think we first want to distinguish private from for-profit, and I think we've had already disastrous experiments with for-profit education in Australia, the help scandal and so forth. I think it's not at all utopian to say that we should, in the very short term, totally prohibit public funding for for-profit education. And I think the same thing can and should be done in the medium term in respect to health. As regards, so that's one part of private activity. I don't see a problem in principle with not-for-profit community organisations providing health and education services. Obviously, the churches have played a big role here, and we know there have been problems, but on the whole, I think it's nonetheless been a positive contribution. So, in my view, for-profit health and education, for-profit educations will be put out of business. I hope in the very near future, and for-profit health in the medium term. I don't see a problem with community-based organisations of all kinds providing those services with public support.
Could you explain in a bit more detail how you see the banking sector shrunk and over the next 30 years?
Yeah, sure. Well, again, as I say, the story is really in two parts. First, there's things we managed to do in the 50s and 60s perfectly satisfactorily, and then there's things we have to go on and do in the future. Banking is one that we did. We had an under-controlled banking sector where, banking was where your not particularly ambitious kid who wanted a nice safe job went, because you knew that they're boring life, but one where you have a job for life. Reasonably respectable, but nothing very exciting. There was a Monty Python sketch I remember in 1970 where somebody had a boring job as an accountant. It was suggested they could do something slightly less boring like merchant banking. Well, that's what we should have. A safe, boring little business that basically takes people's money, keeps it safe, lends it out again on the model of credit unions and building societies. I think we're going to follow up. Well, I guess I see us getting there through another financial crisis. I think we'll have one, and this time they won't get away with bailing out the banks the way they did last time.
So are you saying?
Well, as I say, I think last time we let them get away with it. This next time, I hope we'll be ready politically to say no bank gets any money without the shareholders and executives, the executives all being fired or put in prison, and the shareholders put out this, have their money confiscated, the bank nationalised and closed down.
If you omit these, you really are blind to the fact that we are totally running out of time. The usual way that it was done in the past, when things were crashing, you start a world war. Today, we have reached the confines of a planet, and we have to think differently. We have to hasten the process of developing consciousness, and not think just in terms of economic means. So, as one academic to another, and personally, with all due respect, I fell asleep in your talk. The way that universities think today is no longer functional or applicable. We have to think in alternatives. And if you, as academics, or I, as an adjunct, cannot do that, then we may as well shut up. Thank you.
I'll take that as a comment.
So are you implying that we're going to need another GFC to raise our, to get a sustainable future?
So I think such things will occur because they always do, and in terms of one aspect of things, namely bringing the financial sector to heel, I think until we have another financial crisis, nothing much will happen. in other respects, I think we can make progress. We can make progress without that. We can, for example, transition to a decarbonised electricity supply system, even within the current financial system. The banks are sufficiently frightened, I think, of the future that we're seeing moves away from financing for coal-fired power and so forth, even within the current system. But I think until we have another financial crisis, the power of the banks is too great to really challenge.
All right, so cryptocurrencies, alternative currencies, this world of stuff. What do you see as the value of these currencies in a transition? And does it have the potential to make the banking system as it stands, or in this future you're talking of, obsolete to some extent? Do you see anything like that occurring?
So I'm massively negative. Bitcoin is an environmentally destructive, total fraud and con, chewing up huge amounts of energy to perform useless calculations to make money for people who are simply defrauding other people. So I have zero faith whatsoever in cryptocurrencies.
In terms of seeing a technology that enables social democracy, the blockchain is something nearer that? No?
I remain to be convinced on blockchain. I mean, it seems like an interesting database idea, but so far the only implementation is Bitcoin, which is a disaster. So I remain to be seen whether something useful can be done with it. Zero. I mean, as I say, I try to keep an open mind on blockchain. I have 100%, absolutely zero faith in Bitcoin.
What do you see as the pros and cons of the recycling, reuse, repurpose on a... Sorry, am I not loud enough? Sorry, I beg your pardon. What do you see as the pros and cons of recycling, repurposing, repair on a socialist society?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think at a broad level, we have to reach a point of sustainability, and that implies, for most things, things like steel, aluminium, and so forth, a closed cycle where everything is reused in some form or another, whether that's, as I say, reuse or recycling. So I see that we have to move in that direction. It's not immediate. The links are, I think, partly policy, but also partly attitude. So I've tried not to present a utopia where people suddenly become saints who don't care about having nice things and things like that. But I would hope that, and I was discussing with some other people, hope that in the kind of society I'm talking about, people would be less concerned about having the newest and flashiest thing, happier to say, my happiness is not centred on things, on having new things, as indeed ample research is now showing what I think we understood at an intuitive level back in the 60s and 70s that buying new things is not the way to happiness. So I think that would be a part of a cultural attitude. It's not my area of expertise, so I'm just hopeful there. But that would be combined, I think, with a well-established closed cycle for things like steel and aluminium, and with more of a culture of reuse and recycling. That I think, as I say, we have to achieve a sustainable goal that imposes limits on what we can do. Some of those will be achieved by policy, and some, I think, by cultural change. Thank you.
Power corrupts, and total power corrupts totally. How will you stop your people from being corrupted when they get in power?
Sure. Well, I mean, as I say, unlike at least some socialists, I don't have a vision of a vast central intelligence at the centre of things running the show. As I mentioned in a previous question, my ideal is subsidiarity. So obviously, we have a system, as I say, in most political respects, not fundamentally different from the system we have today. Better in terms of less of certain sorts of sources of corruption being removed, like the power of big money and big corporations. I'd still expect sadly, to see politicians being carted off to jail in handcuffs for taking money to make some decision that somebody wanted, because I don't want to advance a vision that requires people to suddenly become perfect. But I don't see the vision of socialism I'm talking about as creating vast new centralised sources of power. Rather, I think of setting power. So, I'd see, for example, I haven't really talked about it, but building up trade unions. Obviously, we know that if trade unions get too powerful, trade union bosses do the same kinds of things as other bosses do. But clearly, for the last 30 or 40 years, that's been, we have vast royal commissions which discover half a dozen pieces of petty corruption at the same time as tens of thousands of cases of wage theft uncovered on an annual basis. So I see it as more balancing power and reducing the sources of extreme power in our society, rather than creating a central planner who has this vast power. That doesn't mean we won't have, as you say, power corrupts. There will still be power, and it will still corrupt people, just as it always has done.
Hi, I just read the book Utopia for Realists, and I recall him saying in that with the GFC, where there was an opportunity for real change, there was no alternative vision, so nobody had any ideas of what to do, so that the opportunity just got lost. So I'm just wondering how popular your ideas are amongst your colleagues. Is there going to be an opportunity for the next GFC to have these ideas already bedded and ready to go?
Well, certainly that's the point in some sense. We can't just, the point is to have those. It's certainly absolutely true. No one had any other ideas, and the people who were making the decisions in some sense were saturated in the belief that this was the way to do things. So I think that belief is largely gone. That is, no one really now thinks, no one really now has faith in the system as it was before 2007. But what we need is to have an alternative vision that says, yes, this is our chance to do things differently, and I suppose that's why I've set myself to give talks like this. I think there is a lot more interest. I mentioned universal basic income. That's an idea that was around, and as the new big thing perhaps in the 60s and 70s, forgotten about, and is now re-emerging. So I think we're seeing ferments of ideas which just wasn't there on the left was crouched in this defensive struggle, certainly on any kind of economic issues, was totally unprepared for what in retrospect was an opportunity in the crisis. So what we did was pack the existing system up and get it running, and make essentially through austerity make ordinary people pay the bill. So I hope that next time we'll be prepared. And part of that, as I say, is having something more than a managerial rhetoric that says we can do a better job of pushing the system along. It's to say, this system is just the wrong one and we need an alternative, and this is the kind of alternative we want.
So how do we create the next GFC?
Well, I think they'll take care of that for us. I think they're doing a good job in setting the people in charge are doing a very good job of setting the conditions for it. No one can say when, but they're setting everything up to make sure it happens sooner or later.
In the World Social Forum in about 17, 18 years ago in Bombay, no, it was actually 2006, Arundhati Roy, who wrote the book Another World is Possible, there was a quote taken from that, Another World is Possible, and there was a drumbeat that happened from Africa to Asia to wherever. We're in the World Social Forum, which began at the same time as the World Economic Forum, through a rising movement saying that we're people, not money. It's almost like saying let people rule rather than money rule. It was started by Gilberto Gil, the Minister for Culture in Brazil. Another world is possible. In this, we are still looking for that other world, but somehow it seems to me in the rising call of socialism that there's the common thing of the rising call of values rather than throwing out the money god domination. What can you say as a professor of economics that we can do about this rise?
Well, I think another world is possible is indeed the message I'm trying to convey, so probably that's a good place to leave it.